find it fashionable. For this meeting, so I suggest we wait for a few minutes. On a call, I would typically wait for a minute or two, but I think even a minute would not hurt anybody. And we did, according to the registration, I think it is pretty cool. We'll see what happens. There are also people online, right? And if you're also online, you'll have to manage online because I should have brought my computer, but I didn't. So I will ask you to monitor if somebody raises their hand.
Janet is online.
Janet is your partner. And all of a sudden, silence has descended on the list. Well, look, I think if the silence has descended on the room, I think it's probably still better to and my name is Andre Marco. I'm the director of the Green Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. It's a long name, but I always like to say that we invented this name way before people thought about the sustainability and the manageability of the transition. Seems to be more in fashion these days. But obviously, we were concerned with this. We are, in case you are in the wrong meeting, we are on Green Claims Directive proposal, current development, what to expect for climate-related claims. Now, what I was explaining, you know the background. I'm not going to take you to background. I'm supposed to read from here, but I'm not going to. But you all know that the commission submitted in 2023 a proposal for a directive on substantiation and communication of explicit environmental claims, i.e. the Green Claims Directive. Then there's the Parliament's position, then the Council amendments, and here we are. As the RCSD, we come originally from a regulatory point of view. This is who we are, and this is who we are. So we're much more regulatory people than voluntary market. That's how we are. But nevertheless, as I was talking to Margazata a bit earlier, things got mixed and nothing is clear anymore. Things will transcend different DGs, different areas of work. So you can't say I'm only on this. There are things that will lead from one to the other. And in this case, quite clearly, this is about markets, market functioning, about commitments, about removals, about you name it. It's all in there. So all of a sudden, yes, we are interested and we wanted to be involved in this conversation because we supposedly have something to say about this as a think tank. What I wanted to say is that as a think tank, we have two sides to our brain. And the two sides to our brain, one side is that, we accompany pieces of legislation and we try for our best to produce, to provide input to make it better for a better Europe. And I think that's kind of what most think tanks in Brussels do probably. There's a second part to it where we think or we hope that we be able to identify new ideas and new trends and new things that people should look at. And there's nothing bigger or no think tank can be prouder than kind of bringing a new idea to the table. That is like a big success because they had a new idea, something that the politician, the policymaker should be looking at. And when that happens, we're very proud of it. But these are pieces, very concrete pieces of legislation. Now, there's a second part if you are a think tank, and the second part is the fact that when we look at something like a legislation or idea or technology or whatever it is, we also look at it as what is the impact, the long-term impact, what the long impact on society, on Europe, and so on. So this is something that we feel that we have to comment on. But otherwise, you do something else. You don't run a think tank. Now, so in this case, you'll hear a bit from both sides of our brain. What we have tried to do today is to really pick up where we initially put a paper out, I think it was June or May, I can't remember, last year. And then we continue following up and updating the paper. And I think and there is a new paper now that Ana Ruiz here has worked with some of you. And we want to put it forward as a contribution to the debate as to where this is going to land. because invariably is going to land somewhere, and how will it land is going to impact, in many cases, how many of you will do business, either from the supply side of the business, but also from the demand side, and how you're going to meet, or some organization are going to meet commitment being made under different voluntary obligation, which is something that is going to happen. It is, I have to say this, and I'll get it off my chest and I'll say it. We are regulatory people, and we are also much more market than regulatory people. This is who we are. This is our DNA. Some people like us, some people don't like us. And that's what it is. And to me, regulating a voluntary market sounds like an oxymoron, but that's me. And I said this to Margaret before. Please don't be offended if I say this, because I have in the street in our house here, and my mother taught me not to be impolite to people in their house. And my mother was upvoted, so it's okay. So so I apologize for saying this, but I have to take it on my chest. But now getting down to the real business, because this is something that you say, and probably nobody will pay attention. The real business of kind of looking as to where we are. And the program, the way we have it here, we are a round table. The round table is a way of doing business and having a debate. In the end, it has to, the ideas that come to the roundtable discussion has to be concretized into something of intellectual backstop, or else we're just convenient. So Margazata has gracefully agreed today to join us. She's the team leader, environmental footprint and green claims EGN. So again, we never take the commission present for granted. I mean, we're not here to be sycophants, but we know that people are busy, and this is a busy time with changes and new commissioners and you this, that, and the other thing. So we really sincerely appreciate you being here. Ana Ruiz then will will make the presentation of the work we've done. And then I have the pleasure to manage or moderate a roundtable discussion, and it is very few bigger pleasure for me than having Carolina Antonen here. Carolina is from the Ministry of Environment in Finland. She's legal counsel, so better be careful. But it's somebody that has been around for a long time in terms of business and leading it. So I think anybody knows this, and that, so Carolina will know it. We know each other from Article 6 negotiations. So I still remember running around the stadium in Warsaw looking for a drink to start.
Oh, indeed. We have around the entire stadium.
It was we were going in the wrong direction. Anyway, Bill Goldie from Redshaw Advisors, and Redshaw Lewis is somebody that has also been in the Louis Redshaw, somebody been in this market for a long time. He went on to establish his own shop now for a few years and quite successful. Elizabeth Harding. Elizabeth, thank you very much. Negative emission platform, the policy manager there. And then Janet Pease from A New Climate. Janet is on the Zoom from the US. Janet, I hope you can hear us. I don't know if you can, but I hope that you can hear us. We'll make sure that you do so. And then, there you are.
You're coming in quite clear, just so you know.
Janet, a fellow Canadian from Calgary, ended up somehow in Washington, but okay. And then Pascal Sibert from Total Energy. Pascal, thank you very much. And last but not least, their neighbor from AIDA. I have a soft spot for AIDA, and Julia is here, and also from AIDA, and a pleasure that AIDA could join us today. So, Margareta, if you would like to start, and then we'll move on. There is a microphone. The microphones exist. They are up in this thing, and we do hope that they work well.
I think I need to swap places because I don't know see my presentation that you guys. So maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, or from here now.
Sorry about this. I think it's our fault that we should have provided a computer for you. This is not okay.
Maybe I can do the other. Yeah. Good afternoon to all, and thank you very much, Andre, for having me here. Of course, it's my pleasure to present to you, first of all, to present the Green Claims proposal. I know you're here mostly to hear about climate-related claims, but the Green Claims proposal is, of course, about much more than that. So we thought it would be useful to first present a few slides to show you what the proposal is about, and then of course we can enter into a more detailed discussion on the topic of interest. Why are we proposing this directive? Back in 2020, the Commission did a study looking at different environmental claims and labels made by companies. And we're talking about voluntary communication. Indeed, it's the type of communication that companies choose to do because it's their marketing strategy. They wish to stand out from the competitors and inform consumers about performance of their products or of their companies. And that analysis shows that over half of the claims were vague, misleading, unfounded. The environmental information provided on the product was not substantiated in 40% of the cases, and that was true for different sectors, as you can see on the right-hand side, from food, cosmetics, to electronic goods, household equipment, and travel services. And when we asked EU citizens what they thought about green claims, it turned out that, first of all, over 70% believed that it's important for them to take into consideration environmental performance of products. So first of all, it is important to consumers. Secondly, almost 80% thought that companies often make misleading claims. And finally, almost 90% believe that the labels should be verified by an independent organization. In fact, many consumers already thought that it was done, and it was actually quite surprising to discover that sometimes, or often, it is actually not the case. However, we already have EU rules that regulate environmental claims. It's the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, and already that directive, before it was amended in 2024, required that any communication from companies to consumers should be substantiated. It should be truthful, it shouldn't exaggerate benefits, etc. But clearly, as we have seen in the studies we did back in 2020, it was not the case. So first of all, the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive was amended, and in 2024, it actually was published in the official journal, so this is now law. It introduced a few principles that will be helpful in fighting greenwashing. First of all, the directive bans the so-called generic environmental claims, so a claim like good for the environment, sustainable, ecological, or climate neutral. They're believed to be too generic to indicate to consumers where that benefit comes from. So generally, these claims should be more specific. Generic environmental claims can be made in some limited cases, and that's specified in the directive. I will not talk about the Secondly, all environmental labels should be based on certification schemes, so no self-certification labels any longer, or no labels that companies attribute or award to their own products. The directive will require that if companies want to make claims about their future performance, and for example, climate neutrality claims are very popular in this domain, there will have to be a concrete plan with target allocation of resources, and will have to be regularly verified, the compliance with the plan, and then transparently communicated. We have seen in the past big companies making claims about recyclability of their packaging, and then 2 or 3 years later, quietly changing the plan downwards, of course. And finally, and certainly very important to this crowd, the directive bans claiming by companies that products have neutral, reduced, or positive impact on climate if based on greenhouse gas emissions offsetting. But let me highlight, this only concerns claims made at the product level. So if an airline wants to communicate this flight is climate neutral, and that communication obviously is based on carbon offsets, that will no longer be possible. However, at corporate level, such claims can still be made, and this is in line with other existing rules, like, for example, corporate sustainability reporting directive. But let's look at the Green Claims Directive. The two directives are meant to work in complement. There are two sides of the coin. So while the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive indicates what's unfair, what companies should not do, the Green Claims Directive, on the other hand, enters the field of indicating how it should be done. And this is greatly missed. I mean, when we consulted the stakeholders, we have very often heard tell us how we should do it, because we know what we cannot do, but then we're constantly being challenged by the competent authorities when we try something else. So this was definitely an area that needed our action. So the Green Claims Directive is meant to demonstrate, to require from companies a certain set certain requirements for companies on how they should back their claims. It only concerns business to consumer communication, just like the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, and it concerns voluntary claims. So whenever the claims are already regulated in another piece of EU law, of course, we're not regulating it twice. The definition of an environmental claim is pretty broad. So here I will not read it out, but it actually includes any message or representation such as a text, pictorial, graphic, symbolic representation that is meant to show that the product, service, or company has better impact on the environment, or is less damaging, or has improved over time. The key requirements of the Green Claims Directive concern substantiation of claims. Substantiation is the assessment that is behind the claim that companies have to prepare before making that claim. And it sets general requirements. General requirements meaning that directive has to apply to different sectors. So we could not be very specific, including prescribing complete standards, simply because that wouldn't work for all the sectors. And therefore, we set some principles. First of all, it should be backed by widely recognized scientific evidence, including relevant international standards. We don't want companies to come up with their own assessment methods that would, for example, be, let's say, geared towards showing more beneficial impacts of a product. But we prefer companies to use methods that are recognized and especially when there are international standards. What is important, and that's a real novelty, although it's not completely new, because the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and especially the court jurisprudence already required that, companies should be looking from a life cycle perspective. So looking at only one part of the life cycle of a product may be misleading, because maybe the recycled content in this plastic coating of the laptop at the level of 5% may seem like a lot, but then when you look at the life cycle of this laptop, it's peanuts, it's actually marginal, then it can be confusing. So here the Green Claims Directive reiterates the requirements that the substantiation should be based on a life cycle perspective. And within that assessment, trade-offs between different environmental impacts should be identified. I mean, the claim can still be made if there are trade-offs, but the rule is that, and that's also in the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, that the overall benefit should still be positive, so we can accept some trade-offs. When it comes to the use of greenhouse gas offsets or carbon credits, the Green Claims Directive, as proposed by the Commission, is quite succinct. It's also because at the time when we were proposing the directive, there were a few other proposals in the pipeline, including empowering consumers that I have just briefly presented, but also carbon removal certification framework. So the Commission here decided to be more succinct, require that, first of all, companies have to be transparent on the use of greenhouse gas offset. There are no limitations on their use, that these offsets should be of high integrity and accounted for correctly. And then there is an empowerment for the Commission to adopt secondary legislation to set further rules, taking into account the final text, including on CRCF. And here again, it's just a reminder that the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive bans climate neutrality or climate claims based on offsets at the product level. We have foreseen an exemption for micro-enterprises, so companies employing less than 10 employees with a annual turnover below 2 million euros, simply because the scale of communication made by these companies is usually much, much smaller. However, they may still wish to opt in and to comply with the rules for the reasons I will present later. So there is an option, but they do not have to. They will still be, however, under the rules of the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. So they can still be pursued on these general principles. When it comes to communication of environmental claims, so how they are presented, we have very little in the Green Claims Directive because these rules are complementary to UCPD, so the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, which actually focuses on communication. But the Green Claims Directive, of course, requires that companies only communicate what has been substantiated and provide a link or a QR code next to the claim to the information that has to be transparently presented on the website or maybe in the future on the digital product passport, so including the assessment behind the claim. The Green Claims Directive also has an important section on the environmental labeling schemes. These are schemes that issue labels, environmental labels, and overall environmental labels are quite powerful. Consumers tend to perceive goods with labels as environmentally better performing than those without labels. They have to be based on certification schemes, so like at the beginning, no longer self-certification labels and those not managed by independent certification schemes. We are setting clear rules on the transparency and governance of these schemes, including transparency on the criteria behind the labels, the award of labels, there should be the monitoring of compliance and also a dispute resolution. And we are also setting some additional rules to prevent proliferation of environmental labels. There are over 230 environmental labels on the market, maybe even more today. And in fact, when we analyze these labels, for half of these labels, we couldn't actually find any information on how they're governed, what are the criteria behind them. It's hugely confusing for consumers to make any difference between these labels. So we're not banning the labels that are there on the market today, if they comply with the rules of the Green Claims Directive, of course. But in case new actors want to enter the EU market, it is possible under some conditions. First of all, we are proposing that when it comes to schemes developed by public authorities, they should not be developed nationally or even regionally, but we should rather prefer European-wide schemes so that the public authorities pool their resources and develop something coherent for EU consumers. When private actors want to develop their schemes, they still want to do so, but they have to demonstrate added value. And there are some criteria in the directive in terms of environmental ambition, of criteria or coverage of product. But then there will be a system to assess the added value of these schemes. And finally, the same rules would apply to third country schemes, with the exception that also we would not limit the possibility for third country public labels to be present on the EU market. That would be trade distorted. And finally, a very important part of our directive, the real novelty of this directive, is that we are introducing an obligation for companies to have their substantiation verified before they present the claim or label to consumers. This verification would be done by independent and accredited verifiers. They would be competent to certify that the rules of the Green Claims Directive are followed, and they would issue as a result a certificate of conformity. And that certificate of conformity could be issued only once in one member state, would be valid across the EU for up to 5 years. And this is the reason why some micro enterprises may wish to opt in, because in fact it will be like a trust mark of a claim. It will help consumers to build their trust. It will help companies because it will provide legal certainty. I'm making a claim, I have had it verified, I have the certificate of conformity. In case I'm being challenged, I can present this to the competent authorities. And finally, it also ensures a level playing field, because one aspect I did not mention at the beginning is that this directive is not only about protecting consumers from greenwashing, but also companies. I mean, many companies suffer from unfair competition when it comes to sustainability claims from companies that are not diligent, and therefore, with the certificates of conformity, such competition would no longer be there in principle, because making a claim without a certificate of conformity would be against the rules of the directive. Even though we're talking about voluntary communication, in fact, marketing in the end, and companies spend a lot of money on marketing, We still saw that it would be necessary to support small and medium-sized enterprises in the effort of adjusting to the rules. So we had a specific article on that, on the financial support, but mostly technical assistance and guidance on ways to comply, especially for these smaller actors. Where are we today? The Green Claims Directive adopted already in March last year. Before the elections, we managed to have the position of the European Parliament adopted in plenary, and also the general approach by the Council adopted in June 2024. So the institutions are now ready to start trilogues. We're waiting for the Parliament to get ready. The new rapporteurs have been nominated, and hopefully we can start the trilogue already this autumn. We expect the discussions to be concluded in the first quarter of next year, meaning that from that moment on, probably mid next year, once the directive is formally adopted and published in the official journal, the time will start, the clock will start ticking for the member states to transpose the directive and also for the Commission to implement.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me hear maybe back. So I apologize for not having a screen. We should have had one. Then we'll be more clear the next time. We'll now go to the presentation of Anna, and then we have the roundtable discussion. There will be the opportunity after we enter into question and answer with Margarita and the rest of the panel. Anna, please.
Share here. Share. So thank you very much. I'm ready. Sorry. Thank you very much, Margarita, for this brilliant overarching introduction to the Green Claims Directive proposal and all its main features, because indeed it's not just about climate-related claims, but we, as the RCSD, will now focus on this hot topic of climate-related claims in the EU, but not only looking at the co-legislators' text, but also considering a broader context of green claims development in some of non-EU jurisdictions. This anticipates some of our findings from ERCSD's comparative study that will soon be issued. Brief overview: we know that this regulatory approach to green claims, and specifically to climate-related claims, are not novel. We have the example of the US Federal Trade Commission's guides for the use of environmental marketing claims, which was first issued in 1992 and last updated in 2012, and it's currently being reviewed. But nevertheless, we see in the last 2 years mainly a strong momentum from enhancing this regulation and guidance aimed at tackling misleading environmental claims. So several trends and developments in these examined jurisdictions in the EU and non-EU jurisdictions, namely in the UK, US, Australia, and Canada, seek to expand and elaborate in the existing regulatory frameworks of such claims. The question then we propose is in this analysis and studies to see how the EU legal framework compares and fits within these international context developments concerning green claims and specifically climate-related claims. As Margarita already mentioned, in the EU legislative context, we have these EU rules on consumer protection that function as lex generalis, Again, the Unfair Commercial Directive practice already mentioned here, and the Directive on Consumer Rights, that were recently amended by the Empowering Consumers Directive. The Green Claims Directive function here is intended to complement these lex generalis as lex specialis, so a specific regime for this communication and substantiation of explicit environmental claims and about what companies should do to substantiate and communicate these claims. Again, I will skip these very quickly, as Malgorzata already mentioned. Now the new CPD explicit prohibits claims based on the offsetting of greenhouse emissions that a product that is a good or a service as a neutral, reduced, or positive impact on the environment is added as a misleading practice under Annex 1 of the revised UCPD, but clarifies that such prohibition should not prevent companies to do these climate claims. So corporate climate claims, as already Malgorzata mentioned, are admissible. These General Consumer Protection Directive, however, as I mentioned as well, does not specify what companies should do to exactly and properly do to substantiate their environmental claims, specific climate-related claims. Now entering in the concrete text, the European Commission chose for a more kind of minimalistic and a more less prescriptive approach, foreseeing that the substantiation assessment of corporate climate-related claims, besides the general requirements, should also separate any greenhouse gas emissions offsets used, specified whether those offsets relate to emissions reductions or removals, and describe how the offsets relied upon are by integrity and accounted for correctly. The European Parliament introduced several amendments regarding this topic. In March, it started by introducing this distinction between compensation and contribution claim, however, without providing a specific definition in Article 2, which foresees the definition of the directive. For compensation claims, it introduced several restrictions. I think we are also all aware of them here by now, but I will go through them. It makes only possible compensation claims regarding residual emissions. The underpinning credits should be units certified under the Carbon Removals and Carbon Farming Certification Regulation. It shall be disclosed the share of residual emissions and quantity of credits used and for which activity. Compensation for fossil emissions must be done only with permanent removals, and for claims on future environmental performance, these claims should must comply with the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the delegated regulation of CSRD. The Council General approach also foresees this distinction now between offset and contribution claim, and provides specific definitions in Article 2. For offset claims, the substantiation assessment shall include an explanation of how the trader has set a net zero target as per the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and is on a decarbonization pathway to meet the target, and disclose the percentage of total greenhouse gas emissions balanced out using carbon credits. It also foresees another general requirement for climate-related claims, including those involving carbon credits. the identification of total greenhouse gas emissions, reductions, future performance regarding the emissions and any carbon credits used, and the specification of whether the carbon credits used relate to emission reductions or carbon removals, whether or not the underpinning emission reductions or removal represent a contribution to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in those countries. This contribution here seems to allude to the concept as well of contribution claim. Regarding I wanted to mention that regarding this net zero target as per the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, it's important to exactly understand this cross-reference because according to the CSRD delegated regulation, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, it is mentioned that setting a net zero target means, one, achieving a scale of value chain emission reductions consistent with 1.5, and second, neutralizing the impact of any residual emissions after approximately 90-95% emission reduction by permanently removing an equivalent volume of CO2. This begs the question that we can question if indirectly this implies the need of a company to commit to at least 90% of emissions reduction target in order to make, and therefore in order to substantiate an explicit environmental, an explicit voluntary offset claim. This is also for then the panel and the public after. And finally, for the contribution claims, the European Parliament defines a specific rule. Financial contributions should not be used to claim any improvement of the product or the trader. This is the purpose of compensation claims, and separate any financial contributions from climate or environmental impact. The Council General approach does not detail any provisions, does not relegate any specific provision to this contribution claim, but defines in Article 2 what is a contribution claim, and it says that where the trader claims to have contributed to climate action by purchasing carbon credits, but without using those carbon credits for balancing out a share of its emissions. Now, in our second stage of work and analysis and study regarding the non-EU recent developments about green claims, we looked at the UK Competition Markets Authority Green Claims Code issued in 2021 and the recently adopted UK Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act, which also introduces, expands some enforcement powers that may have implications in misleading environmental claims. The ongoing update of the US FTC Green Guides and the new US government voluntary carbon market joint policy statement and principles. The recently issued as well Australian Competition and Consumer Commission guide about making environmental claims, and Canadian latest Bill C-59, which adds new provisions to the Competition Act explicitly addressing environmental claims. There was this also environmental claims guide issued by the Competition Bureau from Canada, issued in 2008, but they are now archived since they do not reflect the latest developments. So we are now entering kind of our preliminary conclusions from these comparative analysis. We see that a common basis among all EU and non-EU jurisdictions, the selected ones, is that existing consumer rights and or fair competition laws serve as the foundation for dealing with green claims made by business in commercial practice. However, on one hand, common law jurisdictions like UK, US, Australia, and Canada chose to issue guidance, which is by nature usually not binding, intended to assist companies in interpreting their obligations under existing general consumer law. On the other hand, the EU intends to adopt legally binding legislation on the substantiation and communication of green claims. The scope in jurisdictions such as the UK and US, the Green Guides have a broader scope applying to business transactions, and the EU narrowed it down to business to consumer commercial practice. Regarding substantiation criteria, and as also Malgorzata mentioned, these guidance or the legislation require or indicate as good practice that environmental claims must be truthful, accurate, specific, clear, substantiated, meaning evidence-based, relevant, not exaggerated, do not correspond to the requirements imposed by law, necessary standard features, and do not hide or omit important information. In the EU, we have the specific mention to the life cycle perspective vis-à-vis the significance of the claim. And also in the UK, the Green Claims Code mentions that the full life cycle of the product, service, or the whole business may be relevant. Here is not a mandatory requirement, but may be relevant. Regarding climate-related claims, the general criteria also apply to climate-related claims, but in the examined jurisdictions, we conclude that governments also detailed criteria and requirements specifically to be applied to climate-related claims. But not only the level of detail differs, but also the type of criteria or requirements. We distinguish between formal requirements and substantive requirements. In common law jurisdictions, we sort of conclude that they depend for more formal requirements related to this, conducting due diligence, providing information about the scheme, standards, methodology, counting, reduction, integrity, reliability, etc., rather than prescribing specific material rules or material targets or imposing prohibitions. One example is the recent this recent fact that the UK government declined to add any misleading environmental claims to the list of banned practice in Schedule 20 of the new Digital Market Consumers and Competition Act in 2024, despite the advice and recommendation of the CMA. In the EU, it's here a bit, we put a question mark. The European Commission proposal seems more aligned with these guiding principles. Again, also Malgorzata mentioned as the law needs to be general and abstract and to apply to every sector. It's impossible here to kind of enter into much detail, but we have the European Parliament amendment and the Council that might go into the direction of a more substantive requirement or a more material requirement. And finally, the verification and certification, as Malgorzata also mentioned, it's a new thing that does not exist in any other common law jurisdiction that we analyze. This verification extent of the substantiation of the claim. And finally, Thank you for bearing with me. We have some takeaways. As we all know here in this room, in many cases, climate-related claims are underpinned by carbon credits issued in voluntary carbon markets to offset emissions. And the ultimate goal of the Green Claims Directive proposal is to ensure consumer protection and fair competition, but not really to indirectly regulate voluntary carbon markets, or at least influence some choice in that field. While it may not intended to do so, we end up influencing voluntary actions, exposing here the contradiction that Andre already mentioned in the beginning, in the terms of regulating, at least in the second level, voluntary actions and behaviors. So effectively preventing a market-based approach to green claims and consumer protection more generally. Companies will need to track regulations, not only the block of consumer protection regulation, private initiatives on voluntary carbon markets, but also disclosure-based regulations across multiple regions, and adopt a globally consistent approach to carbon offsets, and to ensure that their offset-related claims and disclosures align with the varying requirements of different reporting frameworks. Since trialogues will, at least are expected to begin in autumn, the discussion around certain topics will resume, and it might be we may be questioning some of the EU approach, namely the term residual, and imposing these restrictions specifically, as it may be subjective. It may undermine the ongoing development of voluntary carbon markets and investments in third countries. It may exponentially increase the cost of carbon abatement, and overlook the fact that residual emission targets evolve with technological advancement. And finally, this broader international context also raises important questions. What do asymmetries in the existing and emerging rules, as well as related implementation practice, mean for the competition and distorting international commerce? Could this result in foreign shopping, avoidance of certain markets, and bifurcation of product lines and activities? And could it increase the risks to companies, potentially leading them to underreport, downplay, or altogether abandon their voluntary sustainability initiatives to evade scrutiny?
It's a very thorough presentation. I think that we have listened to the presentation, like to hear some reactions from the panelists, and then also why is the light going off? And we can have some reaction to what you heard from Rosata and from Anna, but also reaction what other thoughts that you may have. So there are 6 panelists. I would like you to keep it to a reasonable intervention, Carolina, but you're coming all the way from Helsinki, so I can't tell you that. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, luckily I am Finnish, and Finns are known for not using too many words, if you can just avoid it. And I don't know, perhaps I should be pleased that I noticed that a lot of the things that I wanted to say, Margaret has already said. So when we talk about the Green Claims Directive, it's more than just climate claims. Climate claims is a small part of a really much wider piece of legislation. And it is there to address a problem. As Margaret said, more than half of green claims are fake or misleading or unfounded. So no wonder consumers are confused. there's 230 or more environmental labels in Europe, in the EU, and yeah, no wonder consumers are confused. On top of this comes the problematic that has to do with climate claims, and that very often has to do with use of carbon credits. Those of us who have been around for long enough know that this is not a new debate. It's been there for pretty much as long as carbon credits have been around, since the days of CDM. And there's doubts over both the quality of these credits, and then there's also doubts about the use of the credits. So do you just use credits and not do anything to reduce the carbon footprint of your own value chain? And while I'm sure the Green Claims Directive is not there to regulate the voluntary carbon market, I think we can see that the EU is, however, touching the voluntary carbon market with certain pieces of legislation, such as the CRCF, the Carbon Removals Crediting Framework. I think that's where you can see, on the other hand, an attempt to incentivize carbon removals in Europe, and also, on the other hand, to impact the quality of particularly removals credits. Then there's the sustainability reporting requirements, also speaking to the way climate action is communicated around. And then there's the consumer legislation, including empowering consumers, and now as the latest piece of regulation, indeed, the climate green claims. And the green claims is there in particular to protect consumers. On the other hand, it's also there to allow those traders who do responsible climate action to stand out, because they will be able to communicate about their action in a reliable, trustworthy manner. For us as regulators, we feel our role is to provide clear and coherent legislation to bring clarity to a market that seems to be in a bit of a state of disarray or confusion. And I think the way Anna described these pieces of EU legislation, that kind of shows that the clarity requirement or clarity actually extends to use terminology. We see words like offsetting, compensating, neutralizing, and then we see contribution and offset claims partially defined, and then again partially not defined. So I would hope that in the upcoming trialogues we can bring a little bit clarity to all of that. I can see Andre is looking at his watch.
No, you have a watch because my I don't know if she has a cue or not, so that's why.
My cue is actually that I want to advertise a study that we will be publishing next week. We commissioned a study from Perspectives and Gaia, looking at international developments in voluntary carbon markets, and also to identify certain trends when it comes to voluntary carbon markets in the light of these developments. The study will be in Finnish. I'm sorry about that, but we'll translate it so you can read it perhaps in October. And the trends that were identified, I'll just put them out there for you, so maybe you can touch on those when we advance with our conversation. One is move away from offset claims. That's pretty obvious, given that the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive already is banning offset claims when it comes to products. Also, increased use of voluntary carbon markets best practices. And then you can see not just EU regulation, but also self-regulation, independent initiatives like the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, SBTI, DCMI, coming up with their own codes of good practice as a way for responsible traders to stand out. Also, the increase of net zero commitments is one trend that's been identified. And also what I find particularly interesting is move away from unit-based mitigation, i.e. like offsetting a ton for a ton, but using more like a budget per ton, which I find may give an avenue for different type climate action. There's also something that the CRCF introduced, of which we can have many opinions, is differentiation of credit types when it comes to their permanence. So, you know, those who know the CRCF know that there are 4 different credit types and they have kind of like different lifespans. So, yeah, this is where I'll stop and looking forward to hearing from the rest of you.
Sorry about this, but you said responsible traders? Did I hear right? I wasn't. No, but
It wasn't personal.
and I started years ago. Listen,
Trader. I'm not a trader. Operations, but the project side.
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Andre, for giving me the opportunity to participate. Thanks for the great presentations, congrats and Anna, which perhaps answered some of my questions that I had poised to ask. I'm going to keep very high level. Richard, environmental markets consultants and advisors based in London. As you mentioned, Lewis and his executive team have been really born out of the compliance market. So Lewis likes regulation, he likes rules, and he believes that the voluntary carbon market could do with more of that to improve behaviour. But Lewis is actually the UK authorities advisor on any carbon fraud cases and has contributed to a number. So that's really where we're coming at this, is we are supportive of the Green Claims Directive broadly. And I think we're all consumers, so you know, why would we not be wanting to protect consumers? But with some caveats, you know, I think the caveats is that the final text should encourage the responsible businesses to speak with confidence on their differentiation. If the final text is too complex or perhaps the penalties too onerous, there's a danger that they're not allowed to speak up because of the fear of the risk reward is not in their favour. I think we need to try and ensure that doesn't happen. So that's a key part for us. You mentioned, Margaret, you know, alignment and accepting other initiatives. I think that one example that we've seen is things like ISO. ISO is, for anyone who doesn't know, is the most internationally recognised guidance and standard in the world. They've recently brought out their own 14068 carbon neutrality guidance. And my concern is, you know, we've worked with some clients outside of Europe, and should they follow something like ISO and not be within the rules of the Green Claims Directive, that would be a concern. So something I hope gets considered, and I hope, you know, the conversations go beyond the trilogue to the likes of ISO and to other regions like the UK and the US who are doing. And I think, Carolina, you mentioned other initiatives, your BCMI, etc. And just, I think, finally on carbon credits themselves, the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Market, which is a wide-ranging group, have done a lot of work on writing through 10 core carbon principles, the high integrity carbon credit, and I think that should apply regardless of what region. And I think it would be a mistake to narrow down the use of carbon credits to the European framework only. I think it would really harm the voluntary carbon market and make it much more difficult for those environmentally responsible businesses to get involved. So we want it to be encouraging, not scaring. We believe that the residual rules that we've seen in other initiatives are negative. Not allowing carbon credits to be used until you get to the end of a net zero journey doesn't make sense to us. We think you should reward businesses that continue to balance their emissions throughout their journey to net zero. I think that's really important. Beyond value chain mitigation, I think misses the point on the psychology of a voluntary system, where you have to go and ask someone for money to contribute to either a removal or a avoidance credit. So we hope that those companies are able to use carbon credits during the journey to net zero and not just at the end of it. And really that's, I think, for us, that was the key points that we wanted to get over.
Okay, that is. Traders are people of few words. Elizabeth?
Hi. So thank you very much for Thursday for inviting me to be part of this roundtable. It's been so far a very interesting discussion, and I don't know how much I've got to add actually after all the interventions. But maybe first, in case you don't know who we are, so I'm from the Negative Emissions Platform. We're a trade association of carbon removal companies. We mainly represent, it's permanent carbon removals exclusively, but we mainly represent the technology developers, the project developers, but we have also what we call ecosystem players. So they are the marketplaces, consultancies, or buyers of carbon removal. But really the core of our association is the technology companies. So maybe just like paint the scale of where we need to go with carbon removals. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that we will need up to 10 gigatons a year by 2050 of carbon removals. And currently where we're at is 2 gigatons, which sounds quite okay considering how long there is still to go. But really the far majority of that is short duration carbon removals. So that is CO2 that's likely to be re-emitted back into the atmosphere within the next few years or decades. And so really, if you want to get to net zero, to get to sustainable net zero, we need to be drastically scaling up permanent carbon removals. So then where does the Green Claims Directive come in? So from the sector, from the permanent carbon removal sector, there is very few financing tools at the moment. And the voluntary carbon market and buying carbon credits is one of those very few financing tools. The sector is really at its nascent stage. It's really mainly startups. A lot of our members have maybe 5 people in their team, and that is it. And they're all people who are very dedicated to the climate cause. And the ability for companies to make compensation claims is a big motivation for companies and buyers who are buying carbon credit. So absolutely, as what Bill's already said, we need to have policies in place to incentivize that, but we also need to have guardrails in place, which is obviously what the Green Claims Directive is trying to do by ensuring transparency and credibility of claims, but also adding things that wasn't in the Commission's original position, such as maybe the like principle. But also companies need to be continuing with their emission reduction efforts. And so we also need to make sure that the Green Claims Directive isn't going against that as well. So that's why the Green Claims Directive is really important. And the Council and Parliament do have quite different positions, as Anna, you rightly set out. And from our perspective, the Council took a while to maybe get to steam, but the final Council position is relatively good. We were really pleased with it. Whereas if you contrast with the Parliament's position, especially around the residual emissions point, that was a really, really big concern for the sector, which I can go into in a moment. But there were also some really good things in the Parliament's position that we would like to see taken on in the final text. And so from our perspective, while companies might not be able to claim to be net zero or carbon neutral till they are truly at that point, there still is a role to play for other compensation claims on the road to net zero. So we need to have rules in place that allow for that. And companies should be able to make those claims as long as the credits are high quality, they're verified, that they are permanent, especially when it comes to fossil emissions. And as I said, that companies must still be on track to on their emission reduction pathway, and that the buying of credits is not impeding on that goal. And so this really does align with the Council's position, because it says that companies need a net zero target, and you also have to declare how much of the greenhouse gas emissions are compensated with carbon credits. The Parliament's position, as we have already talked about, is on the residual emissions was a really big concern. It doesn't actually align with what the Intergovernmental on Climate Change has said for the 3 roles of carbon removals. The first is to accelerate net emissions in the near term. The second is to address residual emissions at net zero. And the third is to get to net negative. The Parliament's position only addresses the second role for carbon removals and ignores sort of the role carbon removals has to play in the near term. And there are sort of differing understanding of what constitutes residual emissions. And the real concern is that companies won't be motivated to buy carbon credits until 2040 or 2050, when we really need to gain financing to the sector now. Otherwise, though, these companies that are being started today just won't be around in 2040, 2050. And we can't just pick our fingers and build this carbon removal sector out of nothing when it takes years and years to build up. So yeah, just final messages and then I'll show them. So first is that investment in permanent CDR has to happen now. And the Green Claims Directive is really important in channeling private investment in carbon removals. The less private investment now in carbon removals, the more we will be relying on public financing in the future. And I know this is something that member states don't want to have. The second is that companies should be able to make compensation claims before net zero, as long as it's not impeding on their emission reduction efforts, and the council's position is good there. And 2 other things actually that I didn't mention, but was in the Parliament's position and that we would like to see taken on. The first is on the like-for-like principle. So CO2, when it's released into the atmosphere, especially for fossil emissions, that is in the atmosphere for centuries to millennia. So it's only appropriate that those emissions get compensated with permanent removals that store the CO2 for a similar time frame. And so this was in the Parliament's position, and we absolutely would like to see that in the final text. And then the last thing was around the CRCF. So it's great that the EU has set out what is seen as high quality, and they're going to be doing that through the carbon removal certification framework. And this will be great because it will set out an EU standard of what is high quality. And so we would support a link between the CRCF and the Green Claims Directive, which the Parliament does do, and also what the Parliament does do. It acknowledges that the CRCF is limited to removals within the EU, and we need clarity of how international credit can be treated on the EU market. So here they say CRCF or equivalent, so that allows for that international credits to also be treated. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, thank you. Janet, you can hear me, I guess, and I can see you. So the views from across the Atlantic, I think that when you read the stuff, you called me, we connected for many years, and it struck a chord.
It did. And I just have to say that we really support this idea of protecting.
Whoops. What idea was okay. That is not good.
Suggest to turn off the camera because it's a connection.
Is our connection or the?
No, it's our connection. Our works.
Okay, it's very unfortunate. I'm not quite sure. I tell you what, Pascal, we'll go to you and hopefully they will reconnect. Maybe somebody can. Maybe you can send her a message to guys. Can we have one discussion? Please, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Pascal Sigard from Total Energy. I wanted to say very report that we support also the Green Claims Directive as a very important to us.
No, Jane, we went to Pascal and we'll come back to you because we weren't sure how long it's going to take.
No, good, all good.
Yes, so the Consumer Directive is very important to protect consumers. That is clearly understood. I've had a lot of positive and progress for that. Our worry is that there are a lot of interactions and especially on the climate part with corporate communication. So it's not about consumer communication, but corporate communication, net zero trajectories, and also with all the reporting which is now starting to be in place with the CSRD that you were mentioning, but also the CS3D, which will be also applying to corporates. We need to speak about sustainability and climate part and how this relates to the green claim. So there is a kind of ambiguity, and that's why I think that the initial, let's say, text from the Green Claims Directive was not speaking about climate offset, for instance, because it's a borderline, might has been added, but then it's lacking clarity between consumers and corporate communication, which is not addressed only to consumers, but to every stakeholders, in particular to investors. We are, let's say, as a company, going to a net transitions, right? So it's oil and gas companies, but we are going to develop, and we are investing today in new energy sources, electricity, biogas, biofuels. So we have already a net zero ambitions together with society, because as energy providers, we need to have full value chain changing. This is for us our first commitment. But we think that carbon credits are key to be successful for the ecosystem. We don't use carbon credits in our trajectory today, but we plan to use it from 2030 on. So this is part of our trajectories. And I wanted to recall also that carbon credits, are important. And this carbon mechanism is created from the Kyoto Protocol, has been restated in the Paris Agreement, is Article 6. It's a tool for countries to exchange emission reductions or negative emissions. And it's also a tool that could be accessible to companies. There is a benefit because it's not only in the CDM on the ETS to reduce the cost of companies, but it's also to enhance ambitions, to enhance the global target, not only the targets of the companies that also using carbon credits and maybe as a flexibility mechanism, but enhance the targets of all the companies and globally all the to reach the Paris Agreement targets. It's important to understand that this market mechanism, and this is also why as a market-based mechanism, is there to finance new geographies which are not able to invest today in emission reduction or negative emissions. It's also enabling to drive investments in other sectors which are today not able to, don't have a regulatory incentive to reduce emissions, like for instance, agriculture, even in Europe. And this is, key mechanisms with a lot of benefits. So I wanted also to say that, of course, this quality questions about carbon credit is a key question. And there is, as you mentioned, a lot of progress also on the voluntary carbon market, but on more regulatory carbon types, maybe towards the Article 6.4, which also gives some progress. We think that it is important to continue to progress on the carbon credits environmental integrity. But we have to recall that even if today, there are some accounting issue because methodologies have some weak points to account the tons which has been reduced or removed. The benefit of this project for environment is almost always clear, right? So there is still a benefit. We need to make it right in terms of accounting. This is a major issue because, of course, the benefits alone has to drive integrity in accounting if it's used in ton per ton by companies behind. So we think that companies need as a prerequisite to drive emission reductions, so to have strategy and actions, investments to reduce their own emissions. That is what we are doing today. But we think that quality of carbon credits is important and is complementary to not to use carbon offset only at the end when you have reached all your potential to reduce emissions, because residual emission is also something that is very hard to define. But we need to have this offset claim enable investment in the carbon market for corporates. It's part of the toolbox that corporates needs to have, right? Because otherwise they cannot take commitment and raise ambitions. We have to look at what has happened. In fact, not only commitment of corporates going to SBTi, for instance, which are maybe now 7,000 companies. That's great, but committing to reduce emissions and to net zero is not delivering on this pathway. When you look at the data, and there has been a World Bank report which has been published along the state and trend of carbon pricing, international carbon 2024, just a few weeks ago, you can see that when they look to 10,000 companies which have, let's say, taken targets or short-term targets that we can compare with reality of emission reduction, 80% of the company are not delivering into scope 3 emission reductions. only 20% are not delivering on scope 1 and 2, right? So it will be the worst case that companies, are taking, let's say, targets that they cannot deliver on. There is, no obligation to take, because it's a voluntary commitment for corporates, but voluntary for corporates means also need of success. So having this tool of carbon offset is very important. And I think we are suffering from probably greenwashing element from the past, that's true, but we have to trust companies that they can find a middle way. It's not to cut everything because some companies had not good behavior in the past. And I think that carbon neutrality is also something which is a bit old, right? Because we don't try to get, carbon credit offsets to be carbon neutral, but as part of our trajectories. And carbon neutrality is not well understood by consumers, but also by anyone, by regulators. And this world is suffering about, probably the history of greenwashing. So for us, we need to work together to have, let's say, the right integrity, the right trust to companies so they can use the offsets as part of the emission reduction strategy.
Thanks, thanks, Pascal.
Janet, you're back? You're muted. You're back, but you're muted.
There, unmuted. It just didn't want to unmute. So you can hear me okay now?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Great. Sorry for the internet problems here on my end. I just think there, have been many good points that have been raised this morning, and so many things that I agree with. Bill said that we need more rules for the VCM. I completely agree. Pascal talked about the importance of disclosure, and I think the CSRD goes a long ways towards that. Full disclosure is significantly important. In California, there was a rule that was passed last year that said carbon market participants, if you are providing credits into the California market, you have to say what those credits are. And if you're using credits for anything, you're using them for any kind of goal, you have to disclose that. So disclosure and transparency is super important. Let me take a step back. And for those of you who don't know who A New Climate is, we're a carbon solutions provider. I lead our advisory practice and our policy practice, and I worked on the carbon market for a very long time, as Andre well knows. And I really see this carbon market as a way to enable finance to flow. And I think there is some real danger, and it's particularly where the Parliament's position is, that it restricts the ability of capital flow towards global emission reductions, to nature protection, and investment in the global south. And we just have to have some guardrails, but we have to enable that to happen, because as IEA has said, we really need to scale up investment. They say we need to scale up investment for, I guess it's, we need to triple it to 4 trillion per year US dollars. That's a crazy amount. And as Elizabeth was saying, there's not a lot of tools out there to enable that kind of financial flow. And carbon credits are just one tool. They're not the only tool. They're not the only thing that companies should use. Of course, it should be reduce and invest. It can't just be buy carbon credits. And I haven't heard anybody ever say that. In fact, there's several studies that have showed that companies who purchase carbon credits actually do more to reduce their own emission than companies that don't. And it kind of makes sense because it's an internal carbon price on themselves. And as Pascal was saying, this is a voluntary world for these net zero goals. And we need those. We need companies to be putting out those net goals. And, it's been shown, there's again, other studies that have talked about how public commitments are a key driver to corporate ambition. So I think, I'm just going to reiterate a few things that folks talked about, that we can't really wait until 2040 or 2050 when companies start investing in these things, whether it's removals or whether it's actually investments in nature. We need those investments now. We can't wait until 2040. So we really recommend that when residual is discussed, it's the remaining emissions, not 2040. It's annual remaining emissions should be allowed to be compensated. I also think it's important to think about this as all kinds of credits, not just removals, not like for like, but all kinds, because we really have a biodiversity issue at hand as well, as a climate issue. And biodiversity is certainly related to climate, but investing in nature helps you with both issues, both biodiversity and climate. So we need to make sure that investments go to all types of emission reductions and removals. I also would argue that it shouldn't just be the carbon removal and carbon farming regulation, that we should really be looking beyond at all types of investment and all types of carbon credit, carbon investments, because we need all of that today. Also, one last thing, I'm not really sure if anybody has mentioned it or not, but voluntary climate action, at least from the US perspective, isn't really counted towards the US national determined contribution. And we really don't see there is a need for corresponding adjustments in the voluntary market. And I think that the Green Claims Directive should clarify that. It doesn't say explicitly that corresponding adjustments are needed, but I think it would help with investment to be clear that it's not needed. So residual, not 2040, all types of credits, not corresponding adjustments, and now and not later. Does that make sense? I'm trying to be brief, Andre, because there's already been a lot said. So I think that pretty much echoes many of the things that have been said already, but I just want to turn it over so we can have a broader conversation at this point. Thank you again for inviting me.
Janet, you opened the door there. You shouldn't have opened that door. You shouldn't have opened that door. Yeah.
Thanks, Andre, and hard to follow you, Janet, after that. My name is Svein Nyberg. I work for AIDA, the International Emissions Trading Association. We are a business organization representing over 300 companies across the entire carbon market ecosystem. And we've been following the Green Claims Directive. I'm going to say GCD because it's going to be in my speech for a bit here. Since the beginning, and our focus mostly has been on the use of carbon credits and how they are recognized and how they work as an interplay with other policies. And in this context of carbon credits, we've actually seen quite a few different forms that the Green Claims Directive has taken over the various positions. I think that there's a few question marks that we're still facing, and we're actually quite progressed in where we're at in the process. So we have trials coming up, but we still have a few difficulties from our side. And the first thing is what Carolina very elegantly expressed, that even though the GCD is not actually regulating the voluntary carbon market, it absolutely does touch upon it. And the only place we've seen this in the regulatory framework in the EU is the CRCF. In the CRCF, it does touch upon quality. We're talking about how removal activities are actually classified, and also the certification system, but we can't decouple quality from actual use case. And for use case in the Green Claims Directive, we have virtually no precedent currently, in the last few years at least, in the framework. So when we look at the discussion currently between the Parliament and the Council mostly, we're seeing terms and definitions of terms being drawn up, like residual emissions, what is a compensation claim, what is a contribution claim. These are terms that are very familiar to the voluntary carbon market. We ask ourselves these questions on a daily basis, but for the EU, it's perhaps not as something that they've been dealing with as frequently and as recently. And we can see from the Council and the Parliament's position, there is no common understanding as of yet what these definitions actually are for these terms, which are becoming very, very important for the GCD. So beyond this point as well, we're seeing several missing, but perhaps just moving pieces for the GCD. We have the Empowering Consumers Directive, we have the CRCF, and here again, I want to emphasize that we cannot decouple quality with the use case of credits. It doesn't really matter what type of removal activities this is a conversation that has to go hand in hand. We're also seeing, there's a fine line being tread right now between non-financial reporting to the CSRD and the ESRS, and also obligations for business to consumer claims for companies. And here we're seeing perhaps contrary obligations for the Green Claims Directive, and we hope that the final text would be able to distinguish the two, but also make it very clear to companies that have to adhere to these obligations, what rules do they have to follow when it comes to business to consumer claims, and what does it actually pertain to when we're talking about non-financial reporting. And to talk about the positions as we have them now currently, the parliaments, the councils, and the commissions, Thank you, Anna, again for the presentation. It was fantastic. On a very surface level, we can see that the council and the parliament have gone quite a bit further than the commission's proposal. We're seeing, again, conversations on when can we, on very technical aspects actually, when can we point out residual emissions? How do we account for sectoral variance? What does it mean when we say contribution claim or compensation claim? These are not necessarily reflected in the commission's proposal. And actually, I think it would be interesting to take a step back and think, we're looking at a consumer protection piece that's dealing with carbon credits. What are the aspects that are actually important for this when it comes to protecting the EU consumer, which ultimately is the goal? Is it to regulate actually to the extent to which or what kind of credits can be used for what types of claims? Or is it to actually ensure that there's a robust system for transparency and accuracy in how they're actually reported? This goes back to disclosure requirements in ESRS. It's actually about giving the consumers the information that they need to have in order to make an informed decision. And does that go beyond just that and going to regulating carbon credits? We think that this remains with how the commission first proposed it and also how the council has ultimately reflected it to be. But I'll just perhaps close by saying, if the Green Claims Directive can be used as a key to actually differentiate non-financial reporting obligations, the obligations for business to consumer claims for consumer protection in that context, and also how this kind of correlates with the CRCF. We might only see the first credits of the CRCF by 2026. So it's very important that from now until we see the Green Claims Directive and its delegated implementing acts, the CRCF and the Green Claims Directive are walking side by side. It's very important that this is actually coupled. Maybe I'll just stop it there. Yeah.
Rata, how much do you know about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement? Which step in your world now? Do you ever step in this field?
Well,
I
had to step in this
No, I just want to know, because I think Janet just opened a door that, you know, I love to walk through. And I tell you what, I once was, what's her name? Who was the head of C2ES in the old days?
Eileen Clausen.
Eileen Clausen. I was in a panel with Eileen Clausen in Davos many years ago, and I was a better person, and Eileen shared that, and I didn't answer every question, and I never answered anything. So I try not to do that if possible, but sometimes as the chair, I also think that the role of the chair is not only to give the floor, but also to promote the conversation. At least that's what the chair should do, I think. So I would have a few questions that maybe some of you want to pick up. One of them is, let me ask you this. Do I understand you correctly, or is my misinterpretation? You mentioned at some point that the existing standards are going to stay there, but new standards are going to qualify in some way through some conditions of some sort. If I pick that up correctly. And that reminds me of Article 6, because Article 6.4, actually, there was a proposal for ILAC, if you remember the Latins in Paris during a long night, where they were going to use Article 6.4 to qualify different other standards. You know, whether it was VCS or gold standard or whatever it was. There was a proposal. It never went that far, but that was that. So am I understanding correctly that at some point this is going to regulate standards that are allowed to be used? Maybe it's my own words and my own interpretation, but it's an interesting question because I intend to take this back to Baku, if that's the case. The other one is, I not fully understand, Janet, because you all talk here very bravely about environmental integrity and so on, but the ultimate environmental integrity is not double counting. And I'm not quite sure how you do this one if you double count the environmental attributes of reduction of CO2 in two different markets. I mean, maybe, and then one of them is regulatory. Article 6. The other one is non-regulatory. It's voluntary. So how does that work? Because if you want this to regulate the voluntary markets in some way, then you can't have it both ways. At least not in my book. I don't know. So I'm just telling you what percolates through my mind listening to the presentation here, and probably everybody in the room hates me because probably nobody wants here corresponding adjustment. I understand that, except the EU. So Anybody wants to pick up on any of these questions? If anybody wants to pick up, if not, I'm happy to open the floor. But am I correct in my interpretation, my own words, in your words?
Yes, I think there is maybe an important clarification as to the use of the term standard. Because well, the Green Claims Directive doesn't regulate standards. It doesn't pick a single standard. It only sets some principles that standards to be used by companies when substantiating claims, that these standards should comply with. So in that sense, in a way, yes, because we want it to be high quality standards, and we have some rules on that. But other than that, for the time being, we're not picking a particular standard. It could be the case later on, and we have, for example, that goes beyond climate claims. We have our own environment footprint methodology that the Commission is, has been developing for over 10 years now. So obviously we may promote that in the secondary legislation to ensure that companies, when there are concrete rules per sector, that companies are incentivized to use these rules rather than go their own way. This is to ensure compliability. But again, it doesn't look like there's, for the time being, any appetite to set standards via the Green Claims Directive more specifically. That's the current situation, and in any case, that's the Commission's proposal on this. When I also mentioned evaluation and approval of environmental labeling schemes or certification schemes, which some people also call standards sometimes. So that's why I said we maybe have to clarify that. So when it comes to environmental labeling schemes, there is indeed a certain oversight on the new labels that would be coming to the market. But this is really to ensure that they add value to what's already there, rather than are repetitive or only partially addressing some environmental impacts or criteria. But I suppose you meant the first, the former.
It's look, I mean, I take a broader view in the English language of qualifying. It's you not maybe not de jure de facto. You do qualify them, or you do put them through some kind of a strainer in order for them to come at the CRDN. In terms of the what Jan is referring to in terms of corresponding adjustment, does the EU have a position on that?
I'm not sure, actually. We would need to see with colleagues from the DG. But we are completely silent in our proposal on this, and then let's see where the co-legislators will want to go with that. But there is discussions within the council, and you have seen the general approach, and the general approach for the time being is indicating that we want to first see the results of international discussions on this before we take decisions within the green claims. I don't think the green claims should be the one taking the decisions because, well, the discussions are much wider than the Green Claims Directive.
Just I want to say about the quality. Of course, there is clearly need of progress, a continuous progress for quality, but not only for carbon credits, right?
Yeah.
That's also people have to understand that you have stigmatism from that carbon credits have issue in accounting. But if you look to all other environmental attributes which are today used by companies and recognized also by countries scheme. If you look to renewable energy certificates, for instance, there's clearly, let's say, also reflections from states, from greenhouse gas protocol, how to enhance the quality of these certificates, right? Can you use a renewable energy certificate of a PV farm at night? Does it make sense, right? So if you look to biogas certificates, and there, let's say, these certificates are used by company to reduce scope 1, scope 2, biogas for scope 1, environmental certificate for scope 2. So the integrity is key, the how to use it is key, but the certificates are key to drive actions, and carbon credits needs to be part of these environmental certificates in a good way with the proper quality and the proper use as a part of this global family.
Do you guys, I don't know the study, but in general, in Finland, do you take a position on this?
Well, we're pretty clear on that. If you want to talk about offsetting, you must have credits that are adjusted, that are authorized under Article 6. So it's super clear. But that goes for offset claims
Yeah.
And we pretty much advocate that we would like to back away from that, or I would say that the word offset has become toxic already. If you look at the independent initiatives, they are finding it very hard to take a stand on offsets. Also, the ISO standard requires corresponding adjustment. And well, just the UCPD having a ban on, well, offset claims for products. It kind of speaks to the toxicity of the entire thing. And we also, well, Finland is a Nordic country. So our Nordic consumer authorities have just come out with their own recommendation. They sort of come back to this problem of, well, generic, very general claims like offsetting. And they recommend that market actors wouldn't use words or terminology like that because it's very hard for them to assess whether these claims are in fact substantiated or not. And I can totally understand consumer authorities in that. And instead, they recommend that people just really describe concrete actions, describe what they actually do, because that is far easier to verify.
Just to say, risk adjustment, I mean, I don't want to go to this topic, but it's not because a carbon credit has a risk adjustment, it is a good quality of carbon credit. So it's an additional attribute that makes sense or not. According to Corsia, it makes sense. For corporate, I don't think it makes sense because when you create a job as a company, you can claim the job as creating the job, and the country is claiming the job creation. When GDP is the same, so there are many double claim. It's not a double counting; it's a double claim because it brings value in different systems. But just be careful; it's not because you have a risk adjustment that the quality of the credit is good or better, and it's an additional feature.
Okay, there's the other issue of residual location. So you have your hand up.
Yes.
If you just tell us quickly who you are
Yes.
and the only thing is that thing doesn't pick up sound very easily, so just.
Okay, well, that's a pity for the people online, but at least the people in the room will hear me. So my name is Gabrielle, I'm from IUGP, and I actually have a question a little bit more, taking a couple of steps back. So first, we respect the purpose of the spirit of the initiative and of the directive. However, we've mentioned substantiating claim, we've mentioned the CSRD, the CSDDD, net zero pathways. When we talk about CSRD, of course, there is also limited assurance in there. And as rightfully mentioned, there is already more than 1,800 data points, which will be published on the sector agnostic standards. I will not even mention you what has been voted this morning in the EFRAG meeting regarding the oil and gas standards, because that's an additional 200 pages. All this information will be published and will be available. What I really want to ask is in perspective to the Draghi report and to the push for the Commission to have the reduction of 25% and 35% for SMEs, is there really a need right now to have this directive? I know it's a controversial question, but I'm absolutely fine with this. Is there really a need to have this directive right now, or is it maybe time to first assess and allow companies to implement, learn from best practices, have this information available on a similar thing as an ESAP, European Single Access Point, where data will be available, where companies will be able to have access to that, but also not disregarding what you mentioned, Elizabeth, regarding the needs to have a carbon market. That can be a tool for transition finance, for example, and that would actually benefit companies in general, would actually reduce reporting burden, but in general, it would also help companies to still stay competitive, because we do have an issue about that in Europe, the more burden we bring on companies.
Okay, Balcozada, you're talking about more philosophical, quite less philosophical, but one broader question about life, happiness, and the pursuit of freedom. There you go.
Thank you. No, it's a very pertinent question. I think on CSRD, we have that mentioned already, so I think it's an excellent opportunity to clarify. Not sure whether that's clear to the audience here, because I touched upon this very briefly on one of my slides. In fact, the Green Claims Directive recognizes that there is CSRD already, and in Article 1 exempts CSRD from the scope of the Green Claims, meaning that we are not at all amending CSRD. So CSRD and corporate reporting are separate, and claims made on corporate report can be substantiated with that corporate report. So we're not changing anything here. One important clarification that maybe we still need to discuss with the co-legislators is, of course, the communications part, because the corporate reports are aimed at shareholders mostly. I mean, they're not aimed at consumers. So there we need to see whether, you know, on, for example, climate-related claims, we may want to set additional rules because these claims are meant to be addressed by to consumers by the Green Claims Directive. So here, that's one clarification. Secondly, do we need this directive? At the very beginning, when I was presenting the Empowering Consumers and the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, I said that there is already an obligation for claims to be substantiated. So it's not that we are introducing a new obligation. We are simply clarifying how to fulfill that obligation. Because the experience with the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, the enforcement checks by competent authorities, and also feedback we received from the companies shows that the rules in UCPD are simply not sufficient. They're not clear enough. So we are just clarifying the obligations that are there already. So I don't think that in the end adds so much to the reporting, because the companies should be doing this already, in fact. It's just that, you know, there's this lack of clarity on how they should be doing that. So
I'm not sure I fully agree specifically on the net zero aspect, because there is also that part where companies will need to you know, communicate on. But net zero is another way of mentioning transition plans. Transition plans are in the CSRD, CSRD, EU ETS. It's in the Capitals Requirements Directive. It's in so many different directives. It's creating a fragmentation. It's creating additional. So for me, I still look at it from a very cautious perspective. But thank you very much for your reply.
Anybody online? I'm told there were a couple of. I'm sorry, I didn't bring my computer. It's my mistake. I was going to say my bad, but then I realized not English. Anybody online? Janet, did you want to come back in some way? I'm not forcing. I just have my back to you, so I can't see very well. And if there's anything, please go ahead. Not also, I'm looking in the room. There are other questions.
I'll just say the corresponding adjustment issue, Andre, that we could spend hours, and I'm pretty sure that our Article 6 negotiators have spent hours. It's not a consistent perspective across everyone, for sure. And I guess my perspective is basically that, yes, corresponding adjustments are absolutely important for compliance markets, but they're not relevant for voluntary markets, which is what the Green Claims Directive regulates. So that's all I opened the door for, is the voluntary market and not the compliance market, because I do believe that corresponding adjustments have a role. And I mean, we're not there yet, and there's very few governments that are ready to actually put that in place, including the US government. But having said that, I think we're at a point where we don't need them for the voluntary market. That's all. Anyway, I'll move on, because we could spend hours.
Chair, there's a gentleman at the back. If you want to stand up and speak loudly and with a deep voice, and also tell us who you are.
So my name is Paul Delecourt. I work at the French Association of Large Companies. So thank you very much for the debate on green claims and specifically on the climate-related claims. I think something that I get from the debate, the discussion, is that there's actually a lot of uncertainties regarding what the companies are going to have to do related to climate claims, related to what are carbon compensations claims or offset claims, what are they going to be used for. And I think there's also a lot of other uncertainties regarding how the companies are going to have to substantiate the claims. Because you saying from a life cycle perspective, you're going to have to analyze whether your claim is relevant from that perspective, which means you have to do a life cycle analysis for every claim that you're making. So it's a lot of charge for a lot of burden for the companies. So actually, there's a lot of uncertainty also, like we're in that, but also the Parliament and the Council wants to bring simplification. but they don't exactly know on what claims, on what products. It's unclear, and they're gonna actually the commission is gonna have little time to do that job to identify the claims that are gonna be benefiting from the simplification. So just the remark is, I guess, why don't you take more time to analyze properly the system that you're gonna put in place, how it's gonna impact on the ground the companies, but also what you want to do with the climate related claims. It just, okay, maybe it's gonna be quick, like the last mandate, but hopefully it's gonna take a bit more time with a bit more analysis on what you're actually gonna put in place for the companies. Thank you.
Yeah, some large French companies after. Let me take a couple of more comments here and then go to a last round of comments from, I was wondering what we were gonna do for 2 hours, but they actually went by very, very quickly. Is there any hand up there or not? Is there anybody online? If anybody wants online, please raise your, is there a hand up?
Yeah.
I see you have to promote that person to a speaker, Anna. Yeah, okay, what is the person's name?
Nicolas Sabina.
Hi, Nicolas Papanikos.
Yes, I'm watching your.
Introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm watching your very, very interesting stuff for the last 5 years. One of the reasons that I have established my company, which is the etsdesk.com, was your very, very, very important information and the way that you look on all the things. From a practical point of view, because I'm on the practical case of the issue, which is connected to the political, but it ends up in the practical commercial stuff. I would appreciate if your very, very good colleagues there could give any indication of if there is any real forecast of when the voluntary carbon markets reliability will be rebound. I can say that in a very, let's say, honest and open and market-based definition. But whenever I speak to my customers, which is in maritime mainly, and sometimes also in industry, the big point of concern is the reliability of them. And I know, and you know better than me, that there are too many reliable credits around the world, but the general perception is that there is something wrong. And we see a lot of publications every day, news, fake news, wrong news, that something is going around. So if in brief, probably Margosata or probably Janet could give some indication of any forecast of when this perception you expect to be revised or stabilized or be better. This will be the holy grail of the discussion. Thank you.
If I had an answer to this, I would be somewhere else right now. And so would Margosata. Probably a few others in the room. There's another gentleman there. Thank you very much, Nicholas. One more question.
Hi, Nicolas Renguian from Sustainable Public Affairs, the Public Affairs Agency representing sustainable fund runners. We have been following closely the Green Claims Directive discussions in the 3 institutions, and I have the feeling sometimes that if there is such restrictions which are proposed on claims related to carbon credit, it's because there is this idea floating that maybe the CDR industry could be financed via compliance market. For example, we know that the discussions around the inclusion of negative emissions in the ETS are starting. So the question is maybe, is the EU ready for this? And should the Green Claim Directive already also give a hint towards yes or not, on yes or not, are we going to have a compliance market? Are we going to regulate the removals through compliance market, or are we going to keep using the voluntary market?
Thank you. Is there any? Go ahead, please. If you want to stand up again, I apologize that somebody put a lot of money in this room, but the sound is not great.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leondina Della Pietra, and I am representing ASMOR, the Alliance for Sustainable Management of Chemical Risk. And I have a question actually about a reference that the Commission has made in the Green Claims Directive for the prohibition on environmental claims for products containing hazardous substances. In particular, we believe that this kind of hazard-based approach to the chemical management will promote a regrettable substitution and will also interfere with various policy objectives. And so we also know that the substitution of a substance with a technology or with another substance by an alternative may pose similar or also higher chemical risk, but also the substitution by alternatives may be also unsustainable from the life cycle perspective, for instance. Let's talk about the footprint perspective or the energy perspective, or also the climate perspective, and this would also be the leaders of the loss of the performance. This would impede obviously industry innovation or even hinder the European Union ability to meet the objectives of the green objective. And also trigger incoherence with the different policy goals. So our question is how the Commission thinks to solve this issue in relation to the green claims, also in relation to the other. Thank you.
Rosanna, if you'll allow, thank you very much. Rosanna, if you'll allow me, I'll go around and so that absolutely. Commissioner always has the last one. So yeah, you want to start? We go this way, kind of your last remarks based on what you heard here, and so anything else that you'd like to, not another intervention, but more of a summation, if you want.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. I think perhaps one final statement to close the discussion from my side is that I think the vast majority of companies, or at least in an ideal world, would be happy to comply with any kind of EU rules that would help consumers make better informed decisions and also reduce the risk of greenwashing. But for lack of clarity in the rules that we actually have in the Green Claims Directive, currently we don't have any actual rules, but ahead of trilogues, we do run the risk of companies that are actually not investing in these in carbon credits, for example, or other activities that reduces their carbon emissions. For the risk of running the risk of any kind of penalty that is proposed. We have some serious penalties proposed by the Green Claims Directive. And of course, if they're running the risk of facing these, they would of course be cautious about investing or advertising any kind of environmental performance. And we do not want to, and we also simply can't afford to slow climate action in this sense. So I think the Green Claims Directive could be an amazing tool if used correctly, and if it can provide the clarity, as you mentioned before, also, and I'll leave it at that.
Pascal?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, we think that tools like carbon credit are very important tools, which will enhance the global goals, and they are very insecure for companies, as it was recorded. So, I mean, any support from states and governments to, let's say, substantiate that there is the willingness to support this type of investment is important, and the Green Claims Directive, especially the Parliament bit, is going against that, right? So there is a voluntary carbon market. The voluntary carbon market probably will not be there forever. Article 6.4 you discussed will take a lot of times. As companies, we like more certainties and more regulations to be, let's say, but we need to be rewarded taking the risk investing in carbon credits. So there is the permanent improvement of this asset class, which is clear, but clearly the benefit of investing in climate fights needs to be, let's say, still encouraged by regulators today.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the discussion. I think it's been a good, lively conversation, and I'm sure there's a lot of takeaways with us here. What I do find positive is that everybody in the room seems to be in favor of increased climate action also by private businesses, which is great. What is called for clearly is clarity. And well, I'm really looking forward to the trilogues and wish you all the best of luck with those ones. And yeah, the ability to walk the line between, providing clear guidance, but then again, not over-regulating, particularly the voluntary carbon market. And I just want to finish by words from my good friend that carbon markets can be transformational when done right.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I've been very encouraged by what I've heard, and thank you for clarifying on what we've got going forward. The voluntary carbon market is definitely been paralysed a bit with the number of initiatives that have come out over the last few years. It's actually given a lot of businesses either an excuse not to invest or a genuine reason to not know what to do until these initiatives actually get to the end of their conclusion. You know, just to give a bit of context, the EU ETS transaction volume last year, transactional value was around 800 billion euros last year, and the voluntary carbon market retired was around 1 billion. So, you know, if it's going to be relevant, it needs to scale significantly. It can only scale significantly if businesses have confidence that they can transact without fear of reputational and now legislational damage. So I think we all look forward to the end of it. I think the chap at the end was also right. It's really important we get this right, and we give the encouragement to businesses who are environmentally responsible to be able to talk about it without fear of negative scrutiny.
So thank you very much for this really interesting discussion. I learned a lot as well from all of this. For my sort of key takeaways, Green Claims Directive has such a huge impact in either channeling investment or cutting investment in valuable projects. And so it's really important that we do get these rules right. And as I said earlier, compensation claims should be allowed before net zero and should not be limited to residual emissions as the Parliament has set out, as long as these claims are verifiable, transparent and credible. And again, I would just like to preach the like-for-like principle. Super important that fossil emissions can only be compensated with permanent removals. Really interesting point on compliance market. I feel like that's a whole different event. We absolutely support a compliance market. We see it as absolutely necessary, but it needs to be really carefully thought out. And it should also be understood it's not a silver bullet, and it alone will not be able to fully finance the sector. We still will need other financing tools to help to get to the scale needed. But again, that's a whole new discussion, and so I don't want to take the time for that. So, thank you.
To you.
Thank you. Well, not easy to conclude, certainly before the trilogue. Maybe one important consideration for you all to remind, because you all know this, the Commission will have to act as an honest broker between the two institutions. So we will have to help them work out solutions that are well balanced, that achieve the objectives without maybe putting too much burdens. So we will have certainly intense discussions ahead of us with the two institutions. From the side of Commission, I mean, the role of the Green Claims Directive, of course, we understand the implications it will have, but I don't think, at least from the Commission side, that we want the Green Claims Directive to be the one that actually regulates the voluntary carbon market, because ultimately this is a directive under consumer protection law. So we also have to keep that in mind. Another objective, certainly for the Commission, will be to ensure that we're coherent with other EU acts. So CSRD already mentioned before, CRCF. I mean, again, the Green Claims Directive is meant to be a tool, a complementary act, not the act that will then deviate from other sector-specific acts. So here again, that will be an important consideration from our side during the trial discussions. And then on the question of simplification, I mean, both institutions introduced some amendments to this end, so we will no doubt have to again find a good compromise between them, and hopefully one that allows us enough time to deliver. That's clear, but again, this is not in our hands entirely for the time being. That we will be, of course, discussing this quite intensely for sure. There was a very specific question about hazardous substances. I mean, you have seen our proposal, and we maintain our position is what is in our proposal, and we will see how much the European Parliament will be pushing for their amendment. Our position has been that this goes a bit too far, and this is what we expressed to the Parliament. So, but the Council has not made the amendments in this respect, so clearly some concessions will have to be made. We definitely want to have a workable solution for the green claims without maybe becoming a chemical legal act. Questions about penalties, that the directive should be more about incentives. I mean, penalties, the ones we proposed are fully in line with the consumer protection framework. And ultimately, it will be for the competent authorities to apply penalties. We're not setting any amounts or quantities. We're just saying what should be considered by the competent authorities when setting penalties. And I think it's in companies' interest, especially those that are diligent, to make sure that those who are not have sufficient disincentives to continue. But again, on that, we will have discussions between the Parliament and the Council, because the positions differ on this point as well. But of course, the point on incentives rather than disincentives is fully understood.
Can I ask a question to the Commission?
You're gonna have the last word after the Commission?
No, because there has been an election of the European Parliament. So what is, let's say, this new Parliament? You know, how does it impact the trilogue? Because I'm not sure there's been so many precedents where, you know, there is a text on the Parliament, now a trilogue with another elected Parliament, which has been some change, right? So how do you see that specificity impacting?
Is that unique?
No, it's not unique at all. It happens every 5 years. There are legal acts that are not finished and unfinished business that is taken over by the new plenary. The position voted by the Parliament in March holds. So this is the negotiation position of the Parliament's negotiators, that they have to take forward. Now, of course, there may be potentially some differences in terms of priorities, but that we don't know. We will only find out when we start this tender.
When we get into it, look, I think that we're all here for an open discussion and different views, and at least from that point, I hope that we all believe that we kept our word, and there are a variety of views around this table. We have not been able to abstain our own views once in a while, like that of life. We will follow up, continue to follow up in the important piece, as you said, Mangulat. I mean, it is dealing with consumer protection, but it dips into quite like many pieces of legislation, these days. And as we see the letters that have been handed out to the commissioner and the mandates that they have, it dips into a whole bunch of things. But if that is good, bad, or indifferent, it will, you know, history will tell. But it again is not that clear silos that we usually have, maybe in another time when life was simpler and clearer. I think that people are obviously interested in this topic. There is a desire for clearer rules for business to be able to invest. There is a point where, let me tell you, I negotiated Article 6 of part with Carolina and others. Article 6, and we imagined in a very simple kind of animal, and now it's turned out into something that we have been negotiating for the last 10 years, for these 10 years from the Paris Agreement. So there is that danger of complexity and adding complexity for good reasons and for a good cause, but in the end, you know, it's the death by 1,000 cuts that leads to enforced paralysis. So you have a balancing act on one side of the guardian of the integrity and consumer protection, and so on the other one, the desire to incentivize and provide a kind of market-based incentive. We will watch with fascination. I'm sure some of the people in here in the room will come and lobby you, or come and lobby a whole bunch of people. We're not lobby, so we'll not do that. But we hope to see you back when this piece of legislation is passed, and then we'll can have a discussion around that at that time. And this is already the discussion today. But first of all, thank you to you. Thank you to all of you that have participated in the panel, and thank you to, and Janet, who's in DC. And thank you to all of you in the audience and on the Zoom, and I hope to see you guys again. Thank you.
Can I just say how important the Green Claims Directive is? And we are watching with bated breath that this gets through the finish lines.
Thank you. Thanks, Janet. Janet, I didn't give you the floor. I am sorry.
Just means another time, Andre. Just means another time. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Good conversation. Good meeting.